In 1942, there was a group of Polish soldiers who had been prisoners of war in Russia, and they were released and sent to the Middle East, to Iran. And once they arrived there, they met a little Iranian boy who had a starving bear cub with him. And the soldiers were so moved by this little bear cub, they felt so sorry for it, that they offered to buy it from the little boy. So they bought the bear cub for a few coins and an army knife. And then they nursed the bear cub using an empty vodka bottle and condensed milk. And as it grew, they added a little bit more to its diet. They fed it some fruit and some honey and some marmalade and whatever they could find. And they named this bear Wojtek, which means happy warrior. The bear grew in size, and the morale of the troops was just rising constantly because they had this creature to care for. The bear grew, and they began to wrestle with the bear. They taught the bear how to salute. They loved this bear so much, they even taught it how to turn on the showers so that if it was very, very hot, which it gets to be in that part of the world, the bear could cool off in the shower. The bear enjoyed having morning coffee with the troops, but the favorite drink of this bear was beer. It would drink a whole bottle of beer and then look in the hole to see where the beer went. And now you know how soldiers are. Sometimes they don't do everything. Give it to the bear. And they said that the bear would take one puff and then swallow the cigarette hole. Now, the day came when these Polish soldiers were going to be sent to the front line in Italy, and they wanted to take the bear with them. Wojtek was part of their community, and they did not want to leave it behind. But it was against the rules to take a mascot or a pet on board a British Navy vessel to be transported to Italy. So they enlisted the bear. The bear became a private with his own serial number, and they got him on the ship, and he got all the way to Italy, where men and women who were in that part of the world reported seeing a bear on the front lines carrying artillery. Now, is this a trick or a treat? This particular bear that I'm talking about is a Syrian brown bear, and that is the same kind of bear as in our very short story that Cindy read for us this morning. It's the only kind of bear that lives in that part of the world, and unfortunately, overhunting and lost habitat is making the numbers of this bear very small, and it's very nearly extinct. I'm sure it's already protected. But that bear is present and talked about in the Bible in 3 or 4 different places. Whenever we hear about a bear protecting its cubs in the Psalms, and I think it's in Lamentations and the story today in 2 Kings, it's always the Syrian brown bear. Now, this story is a story that you will not ever hear in church except today, for all of you lucky folks. It is not part of the lectionary calendar, I'm sure, because nobody knows what to do with this story, where the man of God, the prophet, is walking down the road, and some kids come from a neighboring town and tease him, and he curses them in the name of God, and these 2 she-bears run out of the woods and maul 42 of these boys. So what in the world is happening here? Let's get a little bit of context. A couple of chapters before, a little bit earlier in the narrative, and that will help you understand where we are with the story. Now, there was a prophet in Israel named Elijah, and everybody knows that name. We hear it again in the New Testament. We're all familiar with Elijah. He was the prophet. Now, what is a prophet? A prophet is a person who hears from God and then tells the people what God said. And the prophet does not tell the future. The prophet simply says, you're doing the wrong thing right now, and your consequences are going to catch up with you, and we are going to call that judgment from God. So change your ways. Prophets are not well liked. Nobody wants to hear that they're doing things wrong and that something terrible is going to happen. But they have an opportunity to take a different path, to change their behavior, so this consequence doesn't happen. So that's the job of this prophet. Now, Elijah goes up in a whirlwind and disappears. But fortunately for all of us and all of Israel, God had chosen a successor, and that is Elisha, who is the adult in our story today. Now, Elisha has some tough sandals to fill. He can't prove to people fast enough that he is, in fact, the new prophet. And so the narrator of 2 Kings gives us a list of 3 miracles that Elisha works to prove to everybody that he really is the prophet. Now, the first miracle, he takes a cloak, he strikes the Jordan River, and the water piles up so he can walk across on dry land. Pretty good trick. The second miracle, Elisha finds himself in a village where the spring water is polluted and no one can drink it. They have no clean drinking water. So he does a ritual over this water, and then it is healed, and all of the people can drink the water, and they have a clean water supply. Very, very wonderful miracle, right? Nobody can argue with that miracle. The third miracle that Elisha does so that we will believe that he's the prophet is our story today, where he curses little children and they are mauled by bears. Now, what in the world is happening here? If he's trying to prove to us that he's the prophet, the man from God who hears from God and tells the people, this is a really strange little story. So let's unpack it. And my first question when I read this story was, can this even happen? I mean, can 2 bears maul 42 kids? And we know they're kids, by the way. Scholar Dan McClellan says the Hebrew here is clear. These are young boys, infant to about 16. So there's a lot of them. 42 is a strange number, probably adds a little credibility to the story. But there's a lot of kids, and they're teasing the prophet, and they are all young. So I wanted to know if the bears could actually do that. I mean, think about, I don't know how many people we have here, but 42, maybe 50? That's a lot of people for 2 bears. I mean, you'd almost have to stand in line for your mauling, right? So I asked a wildlife expert who I happen to be married to, could 2 she-bears maul 42 kids? And he laughed and he said, of course not. Where did you hear that story? And I said, it was in the Bible. And he said, oh, wait a minute. If it's in the Bible, let's do our research. Let's do some homework. Make sure that we've got everything right. And he concluded that if the children were in a classroom or an enclosure where the bears could get to them, it could happen. But in our story, they're out on the road. You know what kids are going to do if somebody's chasing them? They're going to run. And the fastest ones are going to get out of there. And the slower ones, yeah, that's not too good for them, is it? You only have to outrun the guy next to you if a bear is chasing you, right? You don't have to outrun the bear. So the bears, yeah, that maybe happened, maybe didn't happen. But that's not the biggest problem with this story. The biggest problem with this story is the man of God. He curses children. He abuses his power and hurts the most vulnerable people in the community. And he gets away with it. He walks away, continues on his route, leaving this massacre behind him. Does anybody else think maybe that's a little raw? Maybe that's not the mark of a prophet? But he never does. He's never held accountable for what happens here. Now, what I'm noticing is that something similar is playing out in our politics. According to an expert on cults, Chris Schuler, there are ways that a person can become an icon. If they represent something greater than themselves, they may not even be in line with the values of what they represent, but once a person becomes an icon, they are untouchable. People will support them no matter what their behavior looks like, because they are supporting what that person stands for in their own minds. And that is exactly what we see here with Elisha. He is the prophet. He is the prophet of God. So we don't go against what the prophet says. Now, decades ago, when I was in an evangelical church, I was in a Sunday school classroom, and we talked about these 2 verses. And I asked, what about the kids? What happened here? And I was told, when God places a man over you, a man of God in a hierarchical position of power over you, you submit. You don't argue. You don't question. It doesn't matter how curious you are. You follow the man of God because he knows what's best, because he is in contact, in communication with God. So we just blindly accept that Elisha's the prophet and that somehow this was for the good of the children and all of us. I have a little bit of issue with that, and I hope that you do as well. Now, there's a quote I want to share with you from, let me see if I can find it, Reverend Benjamin Kramer, who says, "Beware of anyone, even a prophet, stoking fear, hatred, and aggression into the hearts of their followers. Seek out those who are stoking love, kindness, and compassion into the hearts of others while empowering the most vulnerable." Now, why do you think this story about Elisha is tucked in this place? What does God, or what does the author of this story want us to do? Are we supposed to blindly accept what we're reading here as the will of God? Or are we called, are we invited, are we compelled, is it demanded of us that we must wrestle with this passage the way that those soldiers wrestled with Wojtek, the bear? Are we to wrestle with it and find out what exactly is this passage telling us? Maybe it's telling us to beware of abuse of power, that no one should be above the law, that everyone, including Elisha the prophet, should be subject to the law, should be held accountable for these lives of these children, and for the words that come out of his mouth, and for the actions that he takes. And yet Elisha is not accountable. And so when I read a story like this that is so strange and so jarring and so at odds with what we know about God and the words of Jesus, who says, turn the other cheek when someone is humiliating you or making fun of you or even striking you, I always ask, who is not present in the story? Who is silent? And the people who are not present are the townspeople. You can imagine that some of those boys would have run straight to town, screaming and traumatized, trying to get help. And the townspeople would have run over, tended to the wounded, grieving for those who lost their lives, and they would look out and see the man of God walking away without a care. How would those townspeople feel? And who is silent? The bears are silent. Can you imagine what happens to these two bears afterward? Do you think those townspeople are going to rest until those two bears are killed? Of course not. They are going to shoot them, or whatever they did back then. Spears, maybe? Those bears are not going to live either. And the man of God is not held accountable. Is this a trick, or is it a treat? Now, our bear, Wojtek, that I told you about at the beginning, has not mauled any children. And we have a couple pictures of him. Patrick, can you show us one now? And you can look this up. This is where he's a fairly young bear. They're just beginning to train him to do some different kinds of tricks. And is it screen shared for everybody at home? Great, because we want everybody at home to see the bear. Let's go to the next picture, and this is actually in the trench. Now, I don't know about all of you, but I'm not sure if I would feel safe in that trench. But they did. I think this story is a real treat. Absolutely amazing. Now, what happens to Wojtek? After the war, this troop of Polish soldiers and the bear are sent to Scotland. And they stay there until the troops are released to go home, and then they turn Wojtek over to the care of the Edinburgh Zoo. And he lived there until 1963. The bear was 21 years old. And until he died, he loved it when Polish-speaking people came to visit him in the zoo because they were talking his language. And sometimes the soldiers who knew him would come to visit him, and they would throw cigarettes into the enclosure, and he would eat them right up. It is a treat, isn't it? A much happier story than the one in our scripture today. But let's be the church that wrestles with these stories. Let's not be the church that says, oh, that's the man of God or the woman of God or whoever it is. It's the person in office. It's the person in charge. It's the person with power. So let's just do whatever they say. Let's not be that church. Let's be the church that stays curious. Let's be the church that asks questions. Let's be the church that pushes back even on the scripture, because I truly believe that is what this story is demanding that we do. It's saying, look what happens when someone becomes an icon and they are above the law, and do something about it. So let's be the church that thinks about how the most vulnerable among us are treated. Let's be the church that asks the hard questions. Let's be the church that has the conversations. Let's be the church that cares about how we treat each and every person. Let's be that church. And we can start right now. Let's begin today.